is going to be another one of those days where we do a lot of watching, a lot of reading, probably not so much writing. We're going to look at essentially chapter 6. We're going to look at types of research. So there's a lot of stuff here. I've put this on Canvas, so you don't need to write it. You can just look at it. You can take whatever notes that you want. I'm using this as a kind of aide memoir for me. So as we go through this, I'll try from time to time give examples of what they're talking about, or maybe go into something in a little bit more detail. So we're going to look at types of research studies. A big branch of mathematics deals with trying to make sense of the world. And one of the ways that we do that is that we do research, just like scientists do research, statisticians do research. The difference between us and a science is that very often the scientists do the research using statistical techniques. The engineer does research doing it. Medical, for instance, right? All the kind of new breakthroughs in medicine, all of those have a foundation that says we know that these work because we have done some type of research on them. We have collected the data, and that data has shown us that certain things are true. That's essentially what research's job is, right? We're trying to find things, and we're trying to find them in such a way that they are provable, so other people could look at your conclusions and come to the same conclusion. Once that happens in science, it then becomes the accepted truth, right? So if I was trying to prove to you that a vaccine actually worked, one of the ways that I could do that would be to collect data on, and let's say 1,000 people who had the vaccine and 1,000 people who did not have the vaccine, and then just look at the incidence of how many caught the disease that the vaccine was meant to protect you against. And you could use that data as proof then that the vaccine works, or didn't work for that matter, right? You could do that and say, look, you gave a lot of people the vaccine, but 20% of the non-vaccinated people got the disease, but 20% of the people who did have the vaccine also caught the disease. So that vaccine is useless, right? So you could get it in both directions. The type of research that we do breaks down into two main categories. One is experiments, which is almost always done by the sciences. We can create experiments and collect our information from it, you know, whether you're an engineer or somebody in medicine. And the second, and by the way, experiments are really good at getting good data. So if you can get, if you design an experiment correctly, the information that you get from it is very often something that people will accept and be able to replicate. And the other type is called observation. And observational studies have to be done sometimes because there's no other way of collecting the information. So in this case, an observational study, the researchers essentially just observe a participant or groups of people, and it could be to do with behavior. We don't actually make people do anything. We don't pick the people who do the things. So an observational study could simply just be, I wonder, here's a question. Someone might come out and say, I wonder if there's a connection between people who watch football and people who play football. And I wonder if one group is healthier than the others, right? So what you might go out there is get 1,000 people of all ages and sexes that play football, and then get 1,000 people who don't play football but watch it on TV, right? That kind of group. And then you could look at both groups and you could measure what percentage of them got ill in a year, or what percentage died in a year. And you see, in that case, you could compare the two groups and you could come up with a conclusion that might be people who play football live longer than people who watch football, or something like that, right? Now, the problem with that data collection is that it's not very random. The people you are choosing, you didn't make them play football or make them watch TV, right? So wouldn't there be a pretty good chance that the two groups are different in lots of ways, not just the fact that one plays football and the other watches it? Couldn't people who watch football also not exercise at all, eat too much, and maybe older? And maybe those who do play football are younger and do lots of other things as well that are healthy for the body. And can you see that the differences between the death rates could simply just be one of those other many factors? And so you can't say, you know, playing football and watching football are the main reason that you live or die in those two groups. That's what makes observational studies so difficult. An experiment, on the other hand, do a classic one. It's called a clinical trial, but it's still an experiment. They just have different names for them, depending on who's doing it. You collect 2,000 people who've got a certain cancer, and you randomly split them into two groups. And one group receives the old cancer treatment, and the second group receives the new cancer treatment. And then you look at the success rates in each group. Now, that would be called an experiment, because at the beginning, didn't you have an amorphous group of people and you just randomly swapped to two different groups? So if there's any differences between the two groups, isn't the major difference just the treatment? Because everything else is about the same, right? Some were young and had the cancer, some were old and had the cancer, but that was true in both groups. Some had an early version of that cancer, some had later stage of that cancer. So if you do it randomly, those two groups pretty much look about the same, don't they? So if anything different, which is you gave one treatment and you give the other the second treatment, that shows up in the data. And therefore you can then say, this new cancer treatment does better than the old, or it does worse than the old. That can happen too, or it's no different. That's the difference between an experiment. There are lots of other finer details that we'll go into later, but the main difference is observational, you don't pick what the people do. They pick it themselves. An experiment, you randomly split the groups, but then you make them pick one of the two choices typically. So far, so good. I know it's going to be a lot of listening today, sorry about that. Now, when you take a group and you break them into two, randomized experiment is the jargon for that. You randomize the experiment, means you randomize the group, typically into two, but you can even do it into three groups if you want to. And then one group gets the treatment and the other group gets what's called the control. The control group typically get the old cancer treatment, right? And the treatment group get the new one. But there are variations on that. There's a thing called the placebo effect. You ever heard of it? The placebo effect. Now, what would happen in that case is, let's choose a different story. I think that vitamin C stops you from getting the cold. Actually, I do believe that, but I've no good evidence on it. So I'd like to get good evidence on it. So I get 1,000 volunteers. You always pick volunteers. You don't, you know, like in the army, pick people and say you're doing it, right? You ask for volunteers. And so I get 1,000 volunteers and I'll probably pay them to do it. So I need money to do this, right? And the 1,000 volunteers, I put them into two randomized groups, right? So old and young, healthy, unhealthy, everything totally random. And the control group gets a pill that's orange and has a C on it. But there's nothing in it except sugar. It's just normal tablet that's got no active ingredients, right? It's very often called the placebo. And the treatment group, they get a vitamin C tablet, a real one. But if you looked at the tablets, you can't tell who gets which, right? So if people say, what do you get? Oh, yeah, that's the same tablet as I've got. The people who get the treatment don't know whether they get vitamin C or they get the placebo, right? And then they have to take it once a day or whatever for 3 months. And then at the end, I collect how many of them caught the cold. Now, at the end, if the percentage you caught the cold was the same, wouldn't vitamin C tablets not be that good at stopping you catching the cold? But if there was a difference between the two groups, hey, we might have evidence that vitamin C does its thing. Right? But how does this placebo effect kick in? Well, it's not a good idea for people to know what treatment they're getting, because it tends to have an effect on the results. That's called the placebo effect. If you give someone a pill and you tell them that this pill is going to reduce their headaches, right? So they're not going to get as many as they normally get. And they believe that that pill is a real pill that's going to do that for them. Even if that pill has got nothing in it but sugar, right? It's a placebo. Many people have a reduction in headaches. And it's because psychological effects do affect the body. Would you agree that, you know, if you think something's going to do you some good, it might, if you believe it strong enough, stop you catching the cold as many times. Maybe you're going to catch it and then you say, that's a sniffle, I'm not going to bother about that. I'm just, you know, I'm not going to sit down and, you know, feel sorry for myself and catch the cold, right? You just up and move around. It's called the placebo effect. It's remarkably strong. And so when they do these experiments, they try and make sure that the control group gets something. And that way, they don't know what they're getting. And while we're at that, we'll introduce some new terms as well. In that story I gave, it could be a blind or a double-blind experiment. In a blind experiment, the person getting the pill doesn't know if they're getting vitamin C or not. In a double-blind experiment, the doctor, because normally this is done through your doctors that give out these pills and collect the information for the pharmaceutical company, the doctor doesn't know what treatment you're getting as well. And they found out that they needed to do the double-blind version rather than just the patient not knowing. And the reason for that was that, not that the doctors told their patients that the pill they were getting was useless, and therefore, you know, it's not going to do you any good. It was because subconsciously they told them. I'll try to give you an example how that happened. Suppose you were getting a pill that was reducing your headaches, right? And they wanted to test it. And the placebo was just a sugar pill, right? It had nothing to do with make your headaches even go away, right? If the doctor knew that you were getting the sugar pill, the placebo, when he asked you when you came in for your monthly checkup, how are you keeping today? How are those headaches going? Can you see that he knows you're getting rubbish and he's expecting you to be in pain? And the way he asks it kind of distorts the data. And it only needs to distort it by a couple of % before you can't tell if anything's improving. Phenomenal effect. It's called the placebo effect. Right, let's look again. This is, well, there's a definition of them. Let's look at explanatory and response variables. Remember, the x-axis is explanatory, the vertical was response. If we were doing, say, the vitamin C story, the explanatory was getting vitamin C and the response was getting the cold, right? If you were doing the pain one, maybe the explanatory was the pill you got and the response is headaches. Now, in a lot of cases, when they do a medical experiment, which is ones I like to focus on mostly, they're very expensive to do. So they try and get as much information as they can. One of the things, for instance, that they like to know is, what is the optimum strength? In other words, how strong should the medical ingredients be to get the biggest effect, right? You don't want to make it so strong, because couldn't the side effects be quite dangerous? but you don't want to make the, the active ingredients quite mild, in which case you won't be able to help people. So very often the people that say the 500 that are getting the real pill, yeah, there might be 50 getting 1 milligram, another 50 getting 2 milligrams, another 50 getting 3, another 50 getting 4. Can you see by that way, when they collect the data, can't they find out which pill provided the greatest amount of effect, right? Very often when they're doing cancer treatments, for instance, it's a kind of moving target. They're not quite sure how strong to make the medication or the radiation. Don't they they do it and they think, oh, that was a bit severe. Maybe we shouldn't have done it that level. We'll cut back. Or maybe that was a bit weak. Maybe we should up the medication, right? Up the cancer, the radiation treatment, whatever it is they're doing. So that's where that information comes from, right? You've got your explanatory variable, which is the degree of treatment that you're giving, and the response very often is, how successful would it be? Because in a lot of cases, the treatment is actually a hill. At the beginning, it's so weak, it doesn't help the cancer patient that much, right? Maybe an extra 1% left. And then it builds up to a nice number in the middle, right? So when you use this level, you get 70% effective. But if you increase that, don't you very often kill your patients? Because remember, these people are really ill, right? They've got cancer. If you make the medication too strong, can't you end up by killing the patient rather than actually saving their life? So that magic hill, and they're trying to find that number right in the center. And they do that by collecting the data and plotting, success, which might be number of patients who are still alive after 5 years. And now that they've got good data, you've also got the right levels to use as your treatment level. Side story here, but it just came to me. Did any of you read an article that said something along the lines that, do you know how aspirin is treated now to reduce your chances of getting heart attacks, right? Thins your blood. Did you know about aspirin as a treatment? Some of you nodding, right? Did you read the article that says they want you to cut back on that? They think that we're taking too much aspirin and it should be a lower dose. Anybody read that article? Right. So how do they know? Well, somebody did an experiment very similar to the one I did and came back with data that was saying, oh, the people who are taking, I'll make this number up, 10 tablets, it ain't helping them, it's hurting them, right? It's making their blood too thin, right? And the people are taking one, it ain't working, right? It's not worth it. You might as well just not take it at all. So that they've figured out what the perfect level is. That was quite interesting. The response variable is sometimes called an outcome variable as well. And there's another name for it. So the explanatory variable is sometimes called the independent, and the response variable is sometimes the dependent. When I take over the world, I am going to destroy all those, here are 3 words that mean this, and here are 3 other words that mean that, and just reduce it to 1 word, I don't care which it is, for each. Remember the straight line one? A line of best fit, least squares line, regression line, correlation line, right? 4, probably another line name I forgot. Wouldn't it be better if we just had 1 name and that was it? But since we've not, there's some. Here is confounding variable, sometimes called lurking variable. We've met this guy before. Remember regression when we did number of TVs against your life expectancy? The lurking or confounding variable was you weren't measuring really how many TVs, weren't you measuring the wealth of the country? So your x-axis isn't always going to be the cause of your y-axis, right? Your explanatory variable is not always going to be the reason for the response variable. So be on the lookout for confounding variables. That's when people make the wrong conclusion based on the data in front of them. And it's so easy to do. Right. Here's a little story about an observational one again, back to observing. And they wanted to know lead exposure, and in particular, children. I think it's past now, but I'm old enough to know that, do you know toys when I was a kid? A long time ago. Little toy soldiers, they were painted with lead paint, a lot of them. Right, meaning it had lead base. It wasn't lead paint also used in painting some houses because it lasted a long time and all sorts of other things? And wasn't there lead pipes for water because they lasted so long? And you might think, well, I've never heard of lead paint or lead pipes. Well, the reason you haven't heard of them is that they discovered that the lead was getting into, in particular, water, and the water was then being drunk by children. Adults, lead poisoning is less severe, but when you're a growing child, they discovered that lead poisoning in particular went to the brain and affected the development of that children's cognitive abilities. And they never even thought about it. It never came to them why that was happening. They never even knew that there was a problem. But they started discovering that there was lots of children, right, as they were developing, weren't developing quite the same rate as other children. And they tried to find out why, right? What was the cause of this? And one of the cause that they came up with was lead poisoning, essentially. And so they took a sample, here's a story, of 24,901 children. And they figured out what their previous lead exposure assessment would be. And they put them into low exposure and high exposure, right? So how would they do that? Well, if you lived in a very old house, you would have lead piping. So that was high. Did the kid get toys that had painted lead paint on them, right? So you put them into two groups, low exposure and high exposure. And in this case, they looked at the dental health. And lead poisoning affects development of the brain. It also affects how quickly, you know, if a child is exposed to a lot of lead, they tend to be smaller. They don't grow as tall. Evidently, their teeth is probably just as bad, right? So they discovered all these things, and they did it by an observational study. A case study is just a fancy name for a particular kind. Now, you might say, well, why didn't they do that as an experiment? This is why. If I wanted to do that same information and collect it, I'd have to get 1,000 kids, randomly split them into two groups, and in the first group, deliberately feed them lead water and lead tablets and tell them to chew on lead toys and anything else I can think of that's got lead on it. And the second group, they weren't allowed anything to do with lead. Can you see how immoral that experiment is? That you deliberately endanger children to prove something is bad. You see, you can't do an experiment with that, right? Some things you have to just do by observation, right? Collect data on groups that have done what they've done, you haven't forced them, they just happen to live in old houses with lead pipes and whatever else, right? And then you can then hopefully come up with what the heck is going on here. There was another breakout quite a few years ago, but it still happens now and again. Ever heard of Legionnaire's disease? Right. Lauren, what do you want to tell me?
I want to say that I have, but I don't know why.
Right. It's a very specific disease. The reason it was called Legionnaire's disease was, I believe, it was a conference that ex-soldiers went to, legionnaires, right? Like, retired soldiers at the organization were called the legionnaires, right? And they went to a conference, and a large number came up with this really weird version of pneumonia, right? Lung disease, really dangerous, really bad. And they couldn't figure out what the heck it was done, what was causing it. And it only happened in a very small area, basically centered around where this conference was taking place. And the CDC, the minute something nasty happens, all the red bells and the fire engines charge in, because they don't want this to like take off and zoom through America, right? And thankfully it wasn't that contagious. In other words, if you caught Legionnaire's disease, it wasn't guaranteed, but it was hard to give it to someone else. So that was a good news. The bad news is they didn't know what was causing it. And so what they did is they basically took every single person that had Legionnaire's disease, and they found out everything they could about it. And that's why they found out it was only in a certain area. It had nothing to do with age, what they ate, what they drank, what clothes they were wearing, and you name it, they tried everything. Nothing matched except they'd all been in this very short area. And what they discovered was that the air conditioning system on the top of the building had water. And in that water, the Legionnaire disease virus had mutated, and it was getting sprayed in the air conditioning system in the building. And so that the people who were in the building or just happened to walk by one of the air conditioning vents when it shut, when it was pushing out the hot air, caught the disease. So it was an observational case study where they were basically just trying to find why people were catching them. It could have been horrible. Do you know if Legionnaire had been really easy to catch from other people who had Legionnaire's disease? It might have been our first version of COVID. It might have been something that zoomed through. Do you know if, for instance, COVID was very difficult to catch from other people, wouldn't it not have been such a big deal? And one of the main problems with COVID is that it's like the flu, right? It's easy to catch from other people who've got it. That's its major problem. Thankfully, it's not Legionnaire disease. Any questions so far? Kind of hard to have questions when there's no numbers involved, but anything you want me to go into more detail before we do the second part? Actually, the second of 3 parts. Well, thank you for hanging in. I think we should break with a joke and then move on to the next part, because there's only so much your brain can handle. Has anybody got any real bad joke for us? Got nothing? Dawn, do you ever tell jokes?
Yeah, I told one last quarter.
Oh, do you want to repeat it?
Okay.
I can't remember either.
I know it was a math joke.
Oh, okay. Eleanor then? Well, Dawn's maybe thinking about it. You got anything?
I have a non-joke.
Go for it.
It's supposed to be it's a joke that doesn't have a punchline, but it's meant to be funny depending on how it's delivered. And my delivery is probably going to be bad. Okay. A horse walks into a bar. Several of the customers get up and leave because they recognize the danger of the situation.
That's it?
Yeah. It's meant to be, it's a non-joke. It's funny because it's completely what you would expect.
Oh.
And it's meant to be bad.
But I can't tell you that joke, but I can tell you
Looked like Lauren liked it.
Oh, God. Who liked it?
I think Lauren did. I thought she laughed.
Lauren? Okay, that's good. Lauren, like, she's good. Laugh out on all her jokes. Right, not a joke, but again, it's meant to be funny. In Scotland, obviously that's where I was born and lived a large part of my life. When you are in a car or you're walking somewhere and you're trying to find instructions, like I'm trying to find a shoe store called McDonald's or something, right? Whatever it might be. If you ask someone in the street how to get there, in America, if someone knows, it would probably be something like, go through 3 sets of traffic lights, turn right, go down 2 more sets of traffic lights, turn left, and you'll see it, right? That's, it's to do with traffic lights or, post office, maybe, when you see the post office, turn left, that kind of instructions. In Scotland, you tend to get instructions by pubs. So what they would say is, you go down this street until you get to the Red Lion pub, and then you turn right. Then you go about half a mile down and you'll see another pub called the Queen's, and it's just across the road from the Queen's. So people tell you about pubs. That's how, most corners have a pub on them, right? That's just the way it is. The problem with that is that pubs change names because a new owner comes, and when the new owner buys the pub, he changes it from whatever it used to be called to his new name. But almost nobody keeps the new names. They're always called by their old name, but their old name isn't even a name. The old name is the nickname. So to give you an example, the true pubs in the area I came from, one was called the Flying Tumbler. Everybody knew it as the Flying Tumbler. And it was never called that, a tumbler, right? It was because it was a really rough pub. And 9 times out of 10, if you stayed there long enough, somebody would throw a tumbler at someone, right? They throw things. That was why it was called the Flying Tumbler. I actually went into that bar once with my dad, and I ducked because literally a tumbler came pretty close to where I was. That was the kind of pub it was like. But the one I'm going to tell you about is called the Rat Pit, R-A-T Pit, the Rat Pit. And you might think it's probably called that because it was dirty and dingy, which it was, but that's not why it was called it. And it got its name. I lived in what was a mining community. It isn't a mining community anymore because all the mines have closed. That's what my dad did. He was a coal miner. Anyway, it was a mining community. And I don't know if you know anything about mining communities. I'm sure there's communities in America very similar to it. But miners are typically as tough as nails. I mean, these guys have a really dangerous job. They're in a place where you could get injured and killed very easily. It's very tough on the body, right? It's really, gruff men, right? You don't want to have a fight with a bunch of coal miners. You're in trouble. Those guys are as tough as nails. So this place was called the Rat Pit, and one particular miner had a pet rat, a real live, not a tame white rat. I mean, one that you'd find in a rubbish dump rat, and a big one, right? And he used to tie a string around its neck like a leash, and he'd walk it. He'd walk down the street with his rat. It was tame. He at least tamed it, right? So give you an idea of how tough these guys are, right? They weren't going to have a little sissy dog. No, I'm going to have a rat. I mean, if a guy could find a tiger, he would have had that as pet, right? But he didn't have them in Scotland. And he went into this pub. And pubs didn't have health regulations like they have today. And they used to have little bowls of nuts. And he put the rat up, and the rat would just eat the nuts and be happy, and he would drink his beer. And he tied the other end to the chair, like the stool, and he went to the toilet. And while he was gone, the rat gnawed through the string and got loose and was running around the floor. And allegedly, all these tough men that we're talking about were jumping up on tables, screaming and throwing tumblers and trying to get out and running about like nobody's business. And so from that day onwards, the pub was called the Rat Pit. And that's what its nickname was. And that's allegedly, although I was never It was always called that even when I was a kid. So evidently that pub has kept its name. Even to this day, if you go to Bellsall and you say to someone, where's the rat pit? It is actually just across the road from the church where my parents were married. So that's where it'll be. And you can tell it's the church. It's at Bellsall Close, and it was built in 1762. So it won't be hard to find that church. Don't you feel better about that story? So if you ever go to Scotland, it'll be a fun place to visit. And some people are thinking that Scotland would be a fun place to visit, although I'm not so sure you want to go to the rat pit, but never mind. Okay, let's move on, guys. I think we needed that. I needed that break anyway. So we're on to 6.2, designing a good experiment. Well, here are some of the features. Randomize. Collect 1,000 people, break them into 2 or 3 groups. 2 is a good number. And each group is randomly assigned, right? You're going to 1, she's going to 2. She's going to 1, he's going to 3, right? And all that, random. That way, both groups are, as far as you can tell, are perfect copies of each other, right? They're full of young and old and healthy and everything else that could be a problem. But because both groups are basically identical in many ways, you take one group and you make that group your control group, right? They're the group that gets the placebo or the old treatment. And then the experimental group, right? The treatment group's another name for them. They get the new pill or the new treatment. And then at the end of a certain period of time, you'll look to see what the differences are. And because the way it's been controlled and set up, any differences that happened must have been due to the treatment that they got, right? The pill that they got. That type is pretty much how many of the pharmaceutical industries prove to the FDA that their new pill or inhaler or whatever it is works better than the old one. The only difference in that situation is that very often the control group don't get a placebo. People that've got cancer have to get some kind of treatment, right? So the treatment the control group tend to get is whatever the normal ongoing cancer treatment is, or if it's asthma, inhaler treatment, right? They still get a treatment, but they just get the old treatment. In those situations, you cannot have a placebo. But if the medication you're talking about is not life-threatening, you can have the placebo introduced. So suppose it's a new headache tablet, right? It's meant to make your headache go away, right? You're not going to die if you get a headache, right? You're not going to feel good, but you won't die. So in those cases, you can introduce the placebo, and that's another way to separate the two groups, and it tends to give very good data. And here's control groups. Here's the placebo. We've talked about the placebo. There's treatment here called binding, but you can look at that. Single blind is when one person doesn't know what it is. Double blind is when nobody knows except you. You might think, how does that work? Since a lot of these are done through your doctor, you get a code number. You're patient 123. And the doctor doesn't know what treatment 123 is getting. He just gets the pill or the injection, whatever it is, to give to the person, right? Patient doesn't know what he's getting either. But you do. But you're the person who's collecting the information, right? And that's what a double blind would look like. A single blind would be, you don't know, right? You're the patient. You don't know what you're getting, but your doctor does know what you're getting, right? That would be a single blind. Here's a variation called the match pair design. We'll let you read about that. Well, quick one. Right. A match pair design is an experimental design in which individuals are first matched on important characteristics, and then each member or pair receives a different treatment. There is a big set of data using identical twins that use this technique. Do you know if you can get identical twins, right? genetically, aren't they very, very similar? And if you can get identical twins that don't have a great deal of difference in lifestyle, like one's an alcoholic and the other's not, right? If you get them both alcoholics or both not, that's great. Those are really good groups, because what you can do is take 1,000 identical twins and take randomly whichever one you want and split them into 2 groups. And then you do something to the first group and you do something different to the second group. Can you see how, because they're almost identical matches of each other, why the data that you get from that is really strong? If there's a difference, it must be that the first treatment is doing a better job than the second. So identical twins are liked a lot. I think there's probably money to be made if you're an identical twin. I wouldn't want to be in lots of medical experiments, but they're that sought after that they actually will pay you. I'll miss out the block one. And let's look at designing now, our third one for today. No, it won't be. I can now see the time. We could talk a little bit about this, but not too much. You know, the observation where you really have no control, you just collect it. There are different versions of it. And retrospective one, let's talk about that. Let's just suppose that doctors are beginning to notice that a certain group of people are getting a very rare cancer, right? And it's coming to the forefront that they're figuring out what is the problem here. Let's take an example. Anybody heard of mesothelioma? Right. Do you know what the main cause of that cancer seems to be? Exposure to what?
Asbestos.
Asbestos. So they were getting an awful lot of this cancer, right? More than they typically used to get, right? At least more of it's being recorded. And so what they did is a retrospective study. They went back and they looked at people who had died of mesothelioma cancer. And they looked at what they did, right? What was their job? Anything they could find out about it. And what they discovered was a common thread. Almost all of them had something to do with working with asbestos, other than the building industry or in the shipbuilding industry or whatever it might be. And now, some of them didn't have any direct connection, but they had an indirect connection. They were married to someone who worked in those environments, and they came home with asbestos on their clothes and their wife got it, that kind of problem. And then they figured out, asbestos. That's how they found out it was that. You went back and looked at those who died or those who are alive and still got it. They were even better, right? But aren't you kind of looking back at that? Now, the opposite of a retrospective is a prospective study. Let's assume, just for argument's sake, that I think habitual cannabis use is going to have an effect on the mental health of those people. They are going to have higher incidences of mental issues. Let's just suppose I believe that is true. How I would do a prospective study? Well, I would find 1,000 volunteers, 500 who are heavy cannabis users, right? Tell me that they use it daily, and 500 who don't use cannabis at all. And I will just watch them for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? The future, prospective, right? The future. And at the end of 5, 10, 20 years from now, depending how long, I will have collected data on both those groups. Now, if the incidence of psychological issues is exactly the same in both groups, then doesn't taking cannabis have no great effect on it? But couldn't it be one or the other? The heavy cannabis use people have a higher incidence or a lower incidence, right? We'll find out when it happens. But you see, we won't find out until the future, because we have to wait for us to collect the data. And that is a long-term study, right? Because I doubt if you'll be able to get good data after 2 months, right? Or even 2 years. Don't you need like 10, 15 years for, if it's one of those slow acting effects, right? That it takes a long time before it kicks in. I think that's a perfect time for us to say last name and bye-bye.